Really appreciate you taking the time and selecting this panel as a session. You will have the opportunity to hear from school leaders and teachers about school-wide models of excellence for serving kids with special needs in the classroom and at the school level. In this panel, we want you to walk away realizing the power of teachers and network-wide approaches successfully serving students with special needs and key levers of successful special education teachers and techniques for supporting them, as well as address some common problems facing the world of education and discuss the implications for the field of special education. My name is Joe Morgan. I'm a 2005 Las Vegas Valley Corps member, and I'm currently an assistant professor of special education in the Department of Educational and Clinical Studies right here at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I want to welcome you to this panel. This is a change of pace for me. I'm not usually a moderator, so I thought I had to keep time and listen, but it turns out there's an official timekeeper, so she'll make sure we stay on task. I want to introduce you today to the people who are joining me. To my left is Paul O'Neill, co-founder and senior fellow at the National Center for Special Education in Charter Schools, followed by Dr. Liz Marcel, a 1999 Rio Grande Valley Corps member and the executive director of intervention services at Renew Schools in New Orleans. We then have Christina Braganza, a New York City 2003 Corps member and the senior director of Team Special Services at Achievement First. We then have Sheena Varghese, who is a Metro Atlanta 2011 Corps member, a special education teacher in the Atlanta Public Schools, and the 2013 Sue Lehman Award winner. And finally, we have Johanna Chase, a New York City 2005 Corps member and the Chief Executive Officer of Special Education for the New York City Department of Education, and a member of the inaugural cohort for Teach for America's School Systems Leaders Fellowship. So our first question to the panel, and this is a question for the whole group, is, what do you most love or think is most motivating about working in special education? We can go in order, and whoever's moved first can speak. It's fine.
I'll start. I would say what most motivates me, and it's not the thing that I love the most, but it's frankly what a crappy job we have done of educating our students with disabilities thus far. In sort of the educational context where we know that between 85 to 90% of students with IEPs have the intellectual capacity to be functioning at grade level when they're given the right supports and services. But for example, we also live in a world where in a state like mine, only 29% of their students are graduating with a high school diploma. That to me, to echo what Elisa said a little while ago, means that there is not a problem with our kids, but a problem with the way that we're educating them. And so I don't know if any of you all have read Strengths Finders, but I do that with my team, and one of mine is context, which is why I always like talking about history. And when I train staff members about special education, I always remind them that it has existed as an entity for less than 45 years, whereas public education has been around for almost 400. And we are trying to educate the most complex kids that we could be educating with the least amount of knowledge and skill to do that well. And so when I talk about that 85 to 90% who can function on grade level, I always say the second part of that sentence is with the right supports and services. And I think sort of on a national level, and certainly within my role in the charter school and education reform movement in New Orleans, we don't have teachers who have developed those skills at a very significant level. And so I am motivated by our really poor results, as well as the national context that's moving towards thinking about outcomes and not just inputs and how much work we have to do.
What I also would add is that, so I work in New York City, and the graduation rates for students with IEPs are also in the 30% range. Particularly, the mission of special education is so closely tied to the mission with the ed reform movement. I mean, across the board, our students with IEPs are underperforming their general ed peers, and the gap is even more profound in areas affected by the achievement gap. And these issues of disproportionality are what drive me to keep doing this work. We have Black and brown students from low-income areas, and particularly Black males, who are more likely to be referred for special education, once referred, more likely to be classified with students with specific disability types, and then once classified, more likely to be placed in a more restrictive environment, where their longitudinal outputs are going to be lower than students who were not in that more restrictive environment. So it's that issue, how the core of special ed reform and the core of ed reform really have the same heart. That's what keeps me coming to the table.
Yeah, to piggyback on what Christina said, since I'm also from New York City, I think that with the great complexity of special education comes in some incredible possibility, not only for our students with disabilities, but for all of our students who struggle. And what we are able to learn from special education is so meaningful for all of our students. So I think that it's an incredible opportunity for anyone who's passionate about ed reform to really take a look and see what teachers are doing well and figure out how we can maximize that impact.
And going off of that, when I was thinking about what I love most about special education, it's really that focus on individualization and being able to actually meet with individual students' needs in a very unique way where you cannot do that as much so when you have 30 students in a classroom. So that's really what I love about special education, and what really excites me about being a special education teacher is that I get to really diagnose like, what do my students actually need and have the time and the place to actually meet those needs specifically.
And I would say, first of all, I feel very guilty that I'm a Teach for America Corps member. Yes, strongly this afternoon. I'm not a teacher. I'm a lawyer. I'm an education lawyer. I used to be a special ed kid. I had a son with autism, and so for me, being involved in this work is very personally satisfying in terms of the connections I have. But I guess to add to what everybody said, what's satisfying for me most, especially in the work that I'm now doing with this special ed center, is how much the problem is good people who want to do right by kids with disabilities and just don't know how, you know? And to be that close, not in every case, but to be that close to helping this problem be a lot better by making it tangible. I think everybody at this table, I'm sure, is in that process of making it better. It's not like something that can be fixed 50 years from now. We can just, do the math. It's really something that's getting fixed now, and hopefully it'll have something better.
Very good. Any additional thoughts? Excellent.
No additional thoughts.
Good. So our second question is directly related to Sheena. And Sheena, can you tell us a little bit about your classroom? How is it designed, and what choices have you made about your instruction to best serve your students?
So just a little context first of all. I have taught students with moderate intellectual disabilities for the past 3 years. So I teach students who are not in that 85% who may be functioning on the same level as their similar age peers. They're students with much more significant disabilities. So that takes a large part in how I design my classroom for them. So first of all, like within that range of my students, there's a large range of achievement still there. So the first thing I do is always like zone my plan out in terms of what different needs are represented in my classroom and how am I going to meet them with the different supports that I have. So with my paraprofessional, with my related services providers, just how do I actually create a system in my classroom where it meets those students' needs. So beyond that, it's really looking at what are the needs academically and how do I get there. And for my students, it's not necessarily looking at just what are the standards and how do I get them to grade level, but how do I think about what would be the best life outcomes for these students and what steps do I need to take to get them there versus just get them to the state standards. So it's really looking at what do their parents need to be educated in doing to provide them with other related services that the school can't provide, like transition services, services beyond 21, beyond 22 for our kids. And then really looking at beyond that, like how do I teach my students about self-advocacy and really change their mindsets? Because I feel like that's more than 50% of what I do in my classroom and with my instruction is teaching my students to change their mindsets and what they can do. And being on the lower end of special education students, you can still see them be empowered and know that they can be more independent than they've ever thought they could be, just based on having someone coach them through that and really develop those mindsets in them. So I feel like that answered the question. Yeah.
Our next question is for Paul. What has been the most compelling finding you've made in your work in the last few years, and what advice would you give to folks in the audience based on that finding?
Well, I'm here with my National Special Ed Center hat on, and so thinking in terms of what we've encountered since October when we launched, I would say that the most fundamental finding is what I would call a lack of trust among the traditional special education community and the charter school community. I think that there's this fundamental worry on the part of traditional special education folks, and I consider myself to be one of those folks on one hand, thinking that those charter schools just do not want to do right by these kids. They don't want to take them, they don't want to serve them, and they want to kick them out as soon as they can. And I hate to say that that's never true, because sometimes it is true. And we started this organization so that we could try to broker some kind of a relationship that's going to build some sort of trust between these organizations with the fundamental bottom line being that we want to do what's good for kids with disabilities in charter schools. Not that we want to do what's good for charter schools, you know? And so everybody seems to be welcoming us now because it's a new idea and we filled this space, but I think we're going to piss everybody off in turn because we want to try and focus on what's good for those kids. And I think developing that trust is absolutely essential if in that particular sector of the public education space, we're going to make any progress.
Our next question is for Liz and Christina. Many charters are grounded in the idea that every student should have the opportunity to go to college. Do you hold this expectation for all students at your schools, or do you differentiate it? And if you differentiate it, how do you determine who gets differentiated messaging, and how do you weave that messaging into a college-bound culture without making kids feel isolated?
So first of all, I'll preface that by saying Renew Schools, which has been operating schools in a turnaround context for the past 4 years in New Orleans. We have 4 pre-K through 8 schools and we have 1 high school, and it's actually an alternative model. It's an accelerated school targeting specifically overage and undercredited, the so-called opportunity youth. So we serve 300 students ages 16 to 22 who had already dropped out, who were in GED programs, or who have been involved in the juvenile or adult justice system and have gaps in their education. So we see ourselves organization-wide as having a mission of serving historically underserved students, even within the context of New Orleans, where that's arguably true for pretty much every kid attending public schools. And then the high school, in addition, is really oriented around giving students the opportunity to graduate from high school. So they don't come in a grade level. They come in completely based on their credit accumulation so far and how many credits they need to accumulate to graduate. And the goal certainly is for those students for whom it's appropriate and who want to go on to college to go on to college. On the other hand, for a lot of these kids who weren't going to graduate from high school in the first place, we're really celebrating that accomplishment. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is that we have a very clear vision and set of values around special education at Renew, one of which is, all of which I think comes in directly in response to what Paul was talking about. My dissertation actually looked at the enrollment of students with disabilities in charter schools in post-Katrina New Orleans, and then I got to sort of turn around and actually do that work. And I came to it very informed by the reputation that charter schools have around serving students with disabilities. So we have an absolute mission around serving every student who comes to our door without ever having to ask the question during an enrollment process about what needs they have. And with that, we have a very firm commitment to providing a continuum of services. One of the other criticisms of charter schools is they may say, yes, you can come to us, but it's going to be sink or swim, and you can survive our inclusive approach, or you could find another school. Illegal, but also just not who I would ever want to be affiliated with, right? So we have a number of students with significant intellectual disabilities, students who have severe autism who are not on track to college. And we've reconciled this notion of college in a few different ways. One is I've stolen a phrase that I got from a colleague who works at another charter network in our city, which is most dignified life outcomes. And we talk a lot about what our students with disabilities' most dignified life outcomes are. And making sure that what we are doing within the setting that has the goal of providing a rigorous college prep education, what does that look like for a kid for whom a 4-year college or university is not an appropriate degree, and how do we maximize an appropriate goal, and how do we maximize the student's potential? The way that we then quantify that, we have a system where we actually have different transition tools for our students' transition plans based on what we think the students' most dignified life outcomes are, based on a whole bunch of data that we collect. So what are those students' student-based assessment results? What assessments are they taking? Is it a performance-based modified assessment, or is it the general assessment? And what are their students' life goals? And we have different pathways that we have developed, and where the question that we're answering is, what is the most ambitious outcome for this student? And then we backwards plan from that. We're challenged in New Orleans, as I think many of our communities are, by not having a lot of community resources that support those transition plans in a quality way. So one of our priorities is trying to build up and identify more of those partners who can do that work with us. But I think, we do have sort of a college prep language, but on the other hand, we also are really aware that our population is diverse, and I think we come back again and again when I train school leaders, when special ed coordinators sit down and talk with teachers, it's again framing it in that most dignified life outcomes piece, and backwards planning from transition goals.
I'm not going to describe what achievement first does. It's very similar. I would highlight the key point is that it is a myth that there are charter schools that do not serve all students. We have the same mentality. Every student who walks through our door, and we are committing to serve that student. I will add that nobody is holding us accountable to doing that, and nobody asks us to report anything. There is no data to show besides our own internal reporting and our own internal accountability systems. And I do think that is a problem. There's two other things I'd like to add. One is around this messaging of college-bound culture. I think that is a very myopic piece of a larger character-building curriculum. We're not just talking to students about college for the sake of college. We're using aspirational language to support students developing an identity where they believe that they can achieve more than they previously thought they could achieve. And that means we're praising effort in the elementary schools. It's not that you are smart, it's that you make yourself smart. In the middle and high schools, we're talking about how your successes or failures are because of factors that are within your locus of control. You can differentiate your effort, your focus, your resourcefulness, and you can have different results for yourself. And so that messaging of college-bound culture is actually a very small part of this larger character and identity building curriculum. And then the only other thing I'd add, which I think is very interesting about this question, is how do you determine who gets differentiated messaging? And I think this highlights an incredible gap in our special education system. So I lead the Special Services Achievement First, and we have 29 schools across 5 districts in 3 states. So it's Rhode Island, New York, and Connecticut. And I can watch a student with similar characteristics in Brooklyn go through the district evaluation process, and that similar student in Bridgeport go through the same evaluation process, and those 2 students come out the evaluation process with different disability classifications and different programs, which says to me our evaluation classification eligibility process is not aligned and fairly broken. And so I think we have to actually solve that problem in order to figure out the question of how do we determine what is the most dignified life outcome for a student starting at age 0.
I can jump back on that. So I don't know if anyone here is from Louisiana, but we've run into a very interesting policy situation recently that's really disappointing, frankly. But our state's Developmental Disabilities Council has lobbied heavily, and a bill was recently passed where the IEP team is now the sole decision maker for what constitutes a student earning a regular high school diploma, with very few stopgaps, right? I think you've probably been looking at this, Paul, but if a student has failed to pass the state standardized assessment for 2 of the last 3 years, you can do that. That is every single student who is served currently by the special education team at Review Schools. And so I think that the reaction to a lot of language around college preparatory is how do we include every student with a disability to a degree that we're starting to actually lower expectations for outcomes, because I think the ramifications of leaving an IEP team, which has a vested interest in not meeting really high expectations for students, is pretty disastrous for kids. And then I think, I actually don't remember where I was going to go with that thought, but I think, again, it's constantly remembering how many kids can be attaining really ambitious results. And then for those kids for whom that's not a realistic possibility, there are so many systems in place in a school that can be replicated with that population. age, these students can still be tracking their own data. They can still be setting really ambitious goals. And one of the things we found in our middle schools is our kids are more motivated. This may be more of a product of where I am, but they're far more motivated by high school than they are by college. And so we've messaged in a couple of our middle schools getting into the best high schools to then have the best opportunities post high school. And that's something all of our students can be participants in.
Our next question is for Johanna. You work in the biggest school district in America. Where have you seen the most inspiring progress among special education students? And what are these students' teachers doing that facilitates that progress and leadership among students?
So I'm going to throw some statistics at you before I answer this question, but in New York State, until about 3 years ago, we were 51 out of 52 states and territories for serving our students with disabilities in the most segregated settings. In New York City, that meant about 50% of our kids with IEPs, give or take, were served completely separate from their typical peers. And so 85 to 90% of our students with disabilities can achieve at the same levels as their typical peers. It just didn't make any sense. And in New York City, what that meant was those students were also had about a 5 to 10% chance of getting a high school diploma, let alone go on to college. So what we did about 3 years ago, and those of you who are from New York City I may see you nod your heads, was implement some pretty significant changes to special ed policy to promote inclusion in our schools. And so what that means is emphasizing opportunities for students to access the general education curriculum, grade level content, time with their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent possible and appropriate for them. But it was pretty transformative, and it still is pretty transformative in New York City because it's forcing IEP teams to think about what services does a student really need in particular subject areas. How often can we try to make sure students have access to the general education curriculum, to the classrooms where their typical peers are in? And so where we've seen schools do really great things and teachers do really great things is by finding those opportunities for individual students. So that doesn't mean completely getting rid of self-contained classes or going full scale to an integrated co-teaching model. That might look like a student accessing grade level content for English during one period of the day and then accessing specially designed instruction to increase their reading level during another period of the day with a small group of students with IEPs. And where we've seen schools do a really amazing job is by making their IEPs living documents where they aren't updated one time a year at an annual review, but ongoing throughout the year as they see kids progress or as they see kids regress. And unfortunately, I would not say that that's happening in every school in New York City. We have an incredible amount of work to do, but where we've seen schools really move the needle is where they are taking an individualized approach and looking at every student and monitoring progress, which is hard. It's really hard work. So we're working to try to celebrate the efforts of those teachers, but I think it's one school at a time.
Our next question is for Sheena and Paul. What do you think is the one practice or strategy that a teacher could implement that would yield the biggest gains for students with exceptional learning needs?
Recently I've been just researching more about what the disability justice movement looks like for our students and what that means to actually, for their self-worth, to consider themselves disabled and to be so excluded from their general peers. And a lot of what that comes down to is the people who they've seen as role models are people with exceptionalities who've been successful, are role models that are so unattainable for them. So I feel like what I found is the best instructional practice has been finding similar geographically located students, similar economically background students as my students, and then showing them models of success that they can actually identify with. And I feel like that's the most powerful thing for my students, period, is to actually see this is someone who looks like me, grew up in the same area, and this is what they did to actually reach these most dignified life outcomes. Because then it is something that's realistic, it's something that's attainable, it's something that they feel like they can actually be empowered to do versus this lofty idea of maybe I won't go to college because that's not something that's actually, it may be ambitious, but it's not realistic for me in my life, in my experiences thus far, in my abilities. So finding role models for them that are actually realistic for them and that reflect them in themselves is something that I found to be the most motivating and the most life-changing for my students.
I'm not a teacher, but I knew I was going to get this question. So I did a little bit of homework, and I talked to the folks in our organization who are the ones who are evaluating instruction and providing best practices. And although I'm supposed to give one thing, I'm going to mention 4 things real fast. One, providing a toolbox of tools for kids that are targeted to specific weaknesses. And in the era of apps and iPads and all the rest of it, there's just a tremendous number of things that convert speech to writing and writing to speech and a million other things that can help kids. And one of the folks gave me an incredibly long email of apps. So I'm wondering if that's something that I can somehow convey to you guys, because it looked really useful to me. So maybe I'll talk to Ellie about if you're interested in that, because they're all targeted to like what they do, and I thought that was useful. Second, teaching metacognition to enhance fluency and comprehension and higher order thinking. And what I mean by that is graphic organizers, time management strategies, note-taking tricks, all sorts of structural things, scaffolding things to help kids who have particular kinds of learning needs to process the information and to succeed. Third, teaching compensatory strategies, just as a general thing. And fourth, teaching self-advocacy. Kids need to take on the advocacy for themselves, understand their challenges, and to know what their strengths and weaknesses are. And I have now seen that my son, who's got autism, is now 13, and he is starting to come around with that. He knows what that means, and I'm starting to see that sort of on the ground, what that looks like. So, without continuing to talk, that's my thing.
And I'd like to add one more thing. I feel like with that also comes like with advocacy for students, advocacy for parents. And I feel like that's a large portion of being a special education teacher is teaching parents how to advocate and showing them role models of parents who they can partner with and get to know who are really effective advocates for their children and showing them what to actually say, those skills on how they actually get the things they need for their students.
Excellent. Very good. Our next question is for Liz, Christina, and Johanna. Can you share some examples of how you've seen principals effectively support teachers in their work with students with exceptional learning needs, specifically in a general education setting?
Sure. So I think what is most critical for principals to do this well is to make sure that all of the teachers in the building are responsible or feel responsibility for all of their students. So it's not just the role of the special ed teacher to make sure that students are included and progressing. It's the role of all of the teachers in the building. Recently, I met with a school leadership team that had a major challenge with suspensions of students, with the disproportionate suspension of students with IEPs. And so they partnered with us through a consortium that we've been working on with the United Federation of Teachers, focused on school-wide behavior supports. And they entered into a year-long professional development and therapeutic crisis intervention supports. And what was a precursor for their involvement in that program was that 50% of their staff, including special educators, general educators, paras, lunchroom attendants, the security guards, participated in this professional development and regular coaching. And it made a world of difference when every adult in the building feels the responsibility for supporting all of the students.
I'm going to add 2 things. In addition to all people in the building feeling responsible for all students in the building, is this structure of a team, whoever the special ed coordinator is, the special services leader, they need to report to the principal. And if that person is not on the leadership team, the voices of oftentimes the special ed teachers are then not heard across the school building. So one thing I'm really proud about is at all of our schools there's a special ed leader, and And then the other thing is building more and more school leaders who have special ed experience. We need more special educators to be school leaders. We need to be like tapping our teachers now who are great special educators and saying like, how are you on the school leadership pipeline? When we look across like our superintendents, our principals, our school leaders, there is a lack of special ed knowledge and experience and backgrounds. And I have a few theories about why that is. I think because once someone's great at special ed, folks are like, don't leave special ed, go find someone else. But I think we have to be more strategic about the way we grow our special ed talent.
So the question is examples of principals effectively supporting teachers and work with students with exceptional learning needs, and I can and I will talk about that. But I do feel like it's important to say that by and large I've been disappointed in working with a lot of Teach for America alums who are school leaders with their receptivity and work supporting special education as of right now. Like I think it is a huge area of need in the school leaders who I see coming out of and evolving from the core. And I think one of the things that has been most problematic for me is the degree to which a lot of adults in school buildings operate on gut instinct rather than on what we know to be true. And I think one example of that is I'm particularly passionate about supports for students with serious mental health and behavioral health needs. And there is such a knee-jerk reaction to provide negative consequences and to punish and to suspend and to expel. And anybody who's spent any time actually researching this topic and interventions that support students with behavioral disabilities can tell you that none of those things teach a child the desired behavior. And what in fact teaches the desired behavior is not a paycheck system where we're constantly deducting points from a child, but actually where we're rewarding the behavior that we want to see and we're continuing to add supports to students and add positive feedback as they're exhibiting the desired behaviors. It's like reading, they're practicing the skills that we want to see. And I just have a lot of frustration with sort of our inability to meet kids where they're at in this relentless effort to have schools that achieve. And I think we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to that work. The flip side is I have gotten to work with some folks, both TFA alums and principals who come to the profession in other ways, who've done some really great things. I think first and foremost, there's a problem-solving mentality, right? Like we often don't have all the answers about how you support an individual child. Special education can be a bit of an inexact science. And if there's a leader who is willing to come to the table and say, okay, so like we're gonna make it work, we might have to change things a few times, and who's willing to message that to their teachers, let's talk about some ideas and figure something out. Just being able to come to the table with that level of receptivity makes a huge difference. What I've seen in our network, especially as a new and young network with so many needs, is that a lot of our general education teachers were not implementing the accommodations and modifications on students' IEPs in an everyday classroom setting. And so some of our strongest school leaders said, okay, I can't be in every classroom all the time and I can't be looking for every accommodation. Let's actually go through all of our kids' IEPs and identify the 3 most common accommodations, and I am going to be looking for those when I'm observing. I'm going to be looking for them on lesson plans, and really sending messages that not just from a compliance standpoint, but from an instructional standpoint, those things are really important in terms of supporting our students. And I think that the other piece is someone who's willing to just live in the tension between the specialized knowledge, instruction, and supports that students with IEPs need, and operating with an inclusive mindset where whether those students are in a separate classroom and they participate in lunch, PE, etc., or whether they're fully included throughout the day, that they're getting that balance of being a fully participatory member of the school community with the specialized knowledge and instruction that they need. And one of the best ways that I've heard people describe that is being really willing to acknowledge that disability is part of a diversity within a school setting.
Excellent. So I'm going to give you all a minute because you're up next. It's almost time for the question and answer. But I'm going to go off script really just for 1 second, as long as Kelly's not getting it. That's good. Yeah. One common thing I think just came up, and I just want to ask if anybody has opinions on this, is I like that you said special is an inexact science. You never really know. So I like this idea of most dignified life outcomes and what's most ambitious. Can you tell me any ways that you ensure that you really are working towards the most ambitious goal? I know in a lot of work I do with teachers and principals, we think we're doing the most ambitious, but we don't really know. So how do you ensure that it really is the most ambitious possible goal that you're working towards for kids with disabilities?
undershoot there, because even if the students don't get necessarily there, you're still building up a lot of the skills that they'll need to get to maybe a level lower or just a little less ambitious.
I think having some percentage benchmarks for large numbers of students is helpful. We've been throwing around like the 85 to 90% number. I think we should have some guardrails around that. For example, we were asking ourselves the question, what percentage of our students should be on modified promotional criteria? And we went and looked at a rich suburban district in Westchester to see what percentage of their students were on modified promotional criteria to use that as a benchmark. So figuring out like what are those guardrails, I think is one step.
One of the things that we've done is build on some research that I was lucky enough to do for a consulting job where I was asked, and I was kind of horrified and then I got into it, but was asked to think about, okay, for each kid by disability category, what should they be able to accomplish by the time they graduate high school? And at first it made me really nervous because these kids are so diverse. So what a specific learning disability looks like for one kid obviously looks really different for another. But I had to do this because I was getting paid to do it. And so ultimately ended up with this really great product where we had taken every single disability category and mapped out what would a really rigorous outcome look like between grades pre-K2, F3-5, 6-8, assuming, here's the major caveat, that student is getting the quality interventions and the language-rich environment and the structured support at home, which is an assumption we can't make for a lot of our kids. But that's been sort of our benchmark for the best possible outcome. And then I think it has looked a fair amount of what Sheena is saying is so we're going to start there, and if we see a student consistently not responding, we're going to pull back from that. The other thing we've done, and I'm going to just call Christina out, she has stolen one of my absolute best staff members. He's moving to New Haven anyway, so, but giving this guy, Alex Gallagher, public credit, he was one of our special ed coordinators and really pushed our team on this question and also on data, because I got to tell you, for 2.5 years, the special ed coordinator team at Renew Schools was like, what data do we want our teachers to be collecting? We had 90 things on the list, and we needed to be more finite about that. And we ultimately landed on, we want to be tracking IEP goal mastery, and we want to be really serious about that. And so we've come up with a framework for writing IEP goals and what do really quality measurable goals look like, if they are growth goals versus mastery goals. And so we train our teachers on writing not formulaic goals, but goals that are measurable. And then we have a pretty massive Excel tool that speaks to our network's data tracking system, and teachers are expected to be entering in progress towards IEP goals on a weekly basis. So we can definitively say after year one of doing this that it was an incredibly messy process, and our kids mastered 39% of their IEP goals, which is kind of crummy data, and it's our year one baseline data. We don't know because the goals were too ambitious, or because we weren't tracking well, or because we weren't teaching well, but we're going to continue to really focus on that. We have some differentiated ways of thinking about what IEP goals mean for students who are participating in the regular curriculum and students who aren't, the role that they play. But I think that's the other big piece of data that we'll be looking at to assess, are we teaching our kids the right things, and are they mastering the content that we believe is most important for them to master?
Excellent. So we've reached question and answer time, and my phone is dead, so you can't hashtag questions on Twitter. You're just going to ask them out loud. So we have some time if there's any questions for the panel. Yeah, go ahead.
Mine's directed to Sheena, but open to whoever else wants to. For those students that y'all kind of mentioned, college isn't necessarily in their future plan, how do you balance in the classroom getting the state goals of meeting those standards for those tests versus the skills that are going to allow them to thrive in a job and career in the real world, because they're not going to be taking tests for their job. They need those skills. How do you balance that kind of tug and pull?
So I guess I'm lucky that my students are on a modified curriculum, and so they don't actually take the full state standard assessment. So they do a modified assessment that's portfolio based. So I'm not expected or required to actually teach the full state curriculum for all 3 grades that are in my classroom at the same time. So it's easier for me to justify teaching less of the standards and more of the skills, that the actual life skills that I know they need, just because I don't have that pressure of them needing to pass the state exam. That's more of a multiple choice state exam. But even if you did have that pressure to do it, I mean, there's just so much more need, and if you just step back and look at the students, and if the student learns 8th grade algebra versus if the student learns how to tie their shoe, how to go up to a stranger, introduce themselves, hold a 2-minute conversation where they're developing relationships with people, like bosses, employees they may be working with. Those skills are so much more important when you look at their extended life outcomes, that I feel like it just makes it so much more justifiable for me to spend more time doing that and finding the space and time to do that than necessarily just trying to get them on grade level.
Hi, I'm Amanda. I just finished my 3rd year teaching in philosophy at Washington, D.C. And so my question is focusing around, I know the briefly touched on it, students who had, I would say, a perceived or acquired special abilities where the child doesn't necessarily have a diagnosed learning disability, but because of the classroom setting and environment, they've been put on this track to have an IEP and put through that funnel. So I feel a lot of times my frustration is that special education seems to be putting a Band-Aid on the cancer. We're catching the problem after the problem has already started. And on the basis of cognitive development, say that a child develops personality traits and likes or dislikes towards things before they even enter elementary school. And how do you, so I see that as being like a partnership with families that you've never had at my school. The other side is like smaller classrooms, right? Like when you can focus one-on-one attention, like a child's not going to be left behind in preschool. So I know that you had said that, Joanna, you said that you partner with normal, like you regenerative teachers, you partner with the SPED teachers to make sure that a lot of students aren't being expelled or sent home early. How do you see special education teachers taking a role in stopping that special education track before it starts for students who don't have those diagnosed disabilities?
Well, I mean, ideally, what you're talking about is really the need for academic interventions, or like RTI, whatever you want to call it, but interventions for students that are not, are not achieving because of lack of instruction, or because, for a whole host of reasons that is impeding their progress. And I think that special educators can absolutely have a role in that many of the strategies that they may have for teaching students with a wide range of needs are applicable for struggling students. And I mean, I think that that's one of the reasons why special ed is like really at the forefront of a lot of reforms that are needed in public education. And so I think you had a lot in your question. So what I would say is that I definitely see special educators as leaders in terms of those that have this really deep toolkit that they can share with the other teachers in their building. My personal preference, and this is my own opinion, this is not the New York State Department of Education, is that every single teacher could be fully certified, and every teacher should be a special ed teacher. But I think that short of that, special educators should be tapped for leadership, which I think Christine made a great point earlier.
I would add a few things to that. Jumping off this idea of intervention, I couldn't agree more. And unfortunately, one of the things that I see happening is this just like incredibly rote and thoughtless approach to intervention into RTI, which is like, okay, this kid is lagging behind in reading skills, I'm going to plug them into one phonics program. No, they're no growth, I'm going to plug them into another phonics program. No growth, okay, I've met my checklist, this kid hasn't responded, I'm going to refer them for a special education evaluation. Well, 2 different phonics instruction programs are not actually 2 different interventions from my standpoint, and nobody's tried a whole language intervention, which a lot of our phonics non-responders will respond to, and you don't need an IEP to be able to participate in failure-free reading, which is a whole language approach, for example. So I think thoughtful RTI, and I think the 2004 reauthorization of the federal special ed law tried to get at that, but obviously policy doesn't dictate implementation. And so I think as much as we can push for thoughtful implementation of interventions before we get to a referral, that would be helpful. I think the other thing we tried to prioritize at Renew is blurring the lines more between special education supports and services and interventions for kids who don't have a diagnosed disability. And I think your question really reflects this idea that special ed is over here and it's reserved for kids who've gone through an eval process, but maybe those teachers are really gifted at small group instruction. So we have done a lot to pull our students who are in Tier 2 and Tier 3 of RTI together with students with IEPs, because many of them need very similar supports and instruction. So we're hiring a lot of folks who we're calling interventionists who are part of our special ed team. They're trained on the paperwork and the compliance ends of that work. They're coded as special educators in our personnel system, but they're not just reserved for kids with IEPs. And that's allowed a lot of flexibility, both in terms of serving more diverse learners, but also in instructional configuration. So if we have a ton of interventionists in the building, we can create pretty easily a more intense and restrictive self-contained setting or resource settings, or we can have everybody co-teaching. There's a lot of flexibility because we've been able to hire more staff that way.
It's a really good question, what you asked. 2 other things just to add is to start the conversation at your school. One thing could be to look at what it means to classify a student as a disability. I think once people see the checklist that we use for diagnosing a student who's been having emotional disturbance, there's this awakening that, oh, it's not a blood test. It's not like a magic test that tells you a student has this disability. There's no magic wand that comes with the IEP. So that can help bridge that gap. And then the second piece is that RTI is the answer and comes with no resources. So, there's a lot of perverse incentives around funding. And if you have a student who really does require more intervention services, more elbow grease, more specialized instruction, stronger tier 1, if you have a student who needs that extra costs something, and the only mechanism that a school has to get that extra is by then classifying them. And those 2 things are working in tension with each other. And it's not a small amount of money. I think that's the other piece. So with big money comes big perverse incentives.
Hi, my name is Tamika Alton. I'm a 2005 South Louisiana Corps member, and actually since my teaching time, I've moved into the school counseling field. So I'm just wondering what suggestions you all might have for individuals who are working as school counselors to support students and families who are dealing with disabilities.
You guys do this really well. I don't know if we do. I mean, honestly, so I would start by saying my advice is more for school systems leaders and counselors, which is hire more counselors because we're so significantly understaffed. It makes it very hard for our counselors to do their jobs, right? With that, I think in a lot of the communities in which we work, our families, when you talk about supporting families, they don't know how to access community supports. And they also don't know what their rights are. And I've seen polar opposites, right? I work with parents who don't know that they have a single right as a parent of a child with disability. And I work with parents who think that they can come in and dictate the name and gender of the paraprofessional who they want hired for their child, you know? And so I think that helping people understand what their rights are and who can support them in learning more about that is really helpful. I do think, as you know, counseling roles are configured so differently from school to school. So if your audience is primarily the student, as much as you can work on teaching replacement behaviors, teaching positive pro-social skills, those kinds of things are incredibly helpful. And then if your audience also gets to be the school staff, number 1, you're really lucky. And number 2, I think sort of staying current on what interventions are that have been proven to work and using those during their professional development would be really powerful. I think the other thing that we have figured out over time in running a therapeutic program where we have a couple of counselors who work exclusively with a small group of students is you just need to unify as counselors, right? Like when we're calling the Department of Child and Family Services, knowing who to ask for so that you actually get some traction. When you have students who are participants in mental health rehabs in the city or who are looking for referrals, like being able to reach out to other counselors and go make those recommendations too. That's not brilliant, so please somebody else.
Well, I would also recommend, I think that depending on how large your school is, I think that what is often challenging for special educators or service providers is that they may be the only person in their building doing their particular specialty. So I would encourage you to create a network for yourself. Like call up, I mean, I'm sure Liz could reach out to some people in South Louisiana, but also just learn what other counselors have been doing effectively.
And start billing for Medicaid.
Yes. That's really important.
Yeah.
So this question might be directed a bit more towards Christina and Jenna. Our organization in New York City, and with the changing political climate that we kind of have going on right now, are there any changes to special needs education that you're kind of expecting or seeing down the pipeline? And then additionally, is there any advice you could give to teachers currently in the classroom that's not really sort of
I think in New York, we're actually pretty fortunate that the mayor has been, both when he was a public advocate and now he's criminal in City Hall, has been extremely supportive of our efforts to reform special ed education in New York City. And I think coming from that advocacy role is a fierce advocate for special education. So I think that, you know, what I would encourage you to do is, one, give me your card, or I'll give you my card, rather, after this meeting. But speak up in your school. Like, if you're really looking for, if you're fighting for the needs of the students within your school and it's not working, like, if you haven't talked to your school leadership team yet, talk to them. And if you know, like, if that's not working, I think, please talk to me. Like, we are definitely going through a period of transition, but our work doesn't change. Like, our students are still there. The goals that we need to achieve with them are still set before us. And I think that it's really important when, during times of political change, to focus on that. And so, that's what
I would add that, like, I'm glad that our climate is the way it is. I would say, like, bring it. It is the way it is now because the system is broken. So from a charter perspective, charters in New York City do not write their own IPs, we don't do our own evaluations, we don't classify students. We work with a district partner called the CSC, Committee on Special Education, and we partner with them to do that. So that means we really get one annual review a year. If we want to rewrite it, if we want to amend the IP, it's not going to happen because we're not going to be able to get that meeting. And it's not because people at the CSC are not really hardworking, wonderful people. It's because they are so underwater. And we tracked last year at the amount of time it took when we sent an initial referral to the IEP being done. It was 161 days. And I talked to, like, my partners in the CSE, and really well-intentioned, wonderful, smart people are looking at me like, Christina, look at the stacks of paperwork I have, look at the system I have, look at the staff I have. This is not feasible. So I think, like, we're reaching this bubbling point for a good reason, and now let's do something about it. Let's bring it on.
I just have a question for all of you guys in your varying roles. How do you guys combat, like, that large stigma that associates students who are in special education? And when we talk about, like, dignified life outcomes, how do we also talk about, like, dignified ways for them to self-advocate with themselves, with really kind of relieving that shame that is often accompanied. I taught students last year in math, and they just came in with so many learned behaviors and mindsets of their abilities and what they could do, being students with learning differences. But how in your current roles do you guys do that?
The thing that immediately comes to mind was, this is not going to be helpful, about right up front. My son, about a year ago, found out what the word autism meant. So he heard somebody say to him at school, "Oh, you're autistic." He still, I don't think it's a perfect idea, but he was doing something wrong. It was definitely not a product of his disability. And we were like, "Wait, Jack, what the heck are you doing?" He's like, "I'm autistic." And they were yelling at me, "I want to." Speaking as a guy who had learning disabilities and ADHD and never got those identified, and I struggled through it, and I managed to survive anyway, and I guess I kind of turned the corner on it. It's hard for me to say what my life would be like if somebody took a label on me. Would I have said, "Oh, well, that's a limitation," or would I have said, "Hey, that means I'm going to get these resources, and that's going to be good for me"? I think it's a hard question to answer because I think there's a dialectic within the special education community about whether it's better to use the structures that we have to ensure that kids get the services that they're entitled to. Or is it better to emphasize that we're just going to try everything we can to challenge these kids, to get them up to their potential? You know, and I think, and I'm interested to know what the other folks here think, I think that's a really hard balance. And I'm not sure exactly where the line is.
Similarly, though, I think that the more students understand what their disability is and how they can define it to friends, sort of kid-friendly language, but also what it means for their outcomes. I think, like, the hardest moment I had as a teacher was when I had a student with mental retardation say, that was his diagnosis at the time, but say, "All these kids keep calling me retarded, am I?" And I'm not going to tell them no, and so we had to have a real conversation. His biggest concern was would that mean he couldn't date girls? Obviously, he was 13. But, that opened the door for kids around, you're not getting pushed aside, you're getting the interventions and the supports and services that you need. They then need to know what those things are so that they can advocate for them. But I think the more that we can frame what's being provided to them as not separate, to my point around disability being part of the diversity, whether that's in a classroom, whether that's on a school level, whatever your locus of control is, so that it's talked about and it's visible to the community of kids who are engaged, in working with kids with disabilities and making sure that those kids themselves know what the disability is and what they need as a result.
Could I go one more piece? I think that another important part is how is the entire school community educated and made aware of these issues? I mean, again, speaking with my son, he would take part in this inclusive thing where they called it lunch bunch, where kids who were in special classes were meeting for lunch and doing all kinds of things with other kids, and it became a kind of thing where everybody wanted to be part of lunch bunch, whether they were in special classes or not. And so I think that what that stigma is has a lot to do with how it's perceived by him.
She just said something earlier about role models, and as you said that, I thought to myself how the character on Glee with Down syndrome did more for kids in our network who had Down syndrome than anything that we did messaging-wise. Suddenly, it changed the culture, and so how do we look to role models, and how do we empower the broader community to all feel ownership of all of our shared histories? That's a cool part.
Yeah, I agree with Paul a lot that it really does come down to the whole school. Because as a special education teacher, if I hold my students to a specific level of expectations where those learned behaviors are not acceptable in my classroom, then they can go next door and they aren't acceptable. So really pushing other teachers who interact with that student, other people in the receptionists, counselors, everyone who interacts with that student to hold them to the same level of expectation so that they get more used to the fact that that's not acceptable to revert back to those learned behaviors.
Hi, I'm Jeff Calvine, for Las Vegas and for 9 years I've been in the classroom. And during my preps, I would always go and basically work in special ed classrooms and help. And 4 years ago, my daughter was born with Charles syndrome, being caused of deaf blindness. And I've noticed throughout the years that the reason why I've been in those classrooms is because the transiency of our special education in Las Vegas Valley is it's really sad, quite honestly. So many long-term subs, and my daughter now this is her second year with a long-term sub, and we are now the educators trying to get these individuals that mean well to try to help my daughter the best way possible. And you guys represent diverse across the nation. Do you have the same issues with special ed, transitive teachers moving around, long-term subs, and how do you guys deal with that?
Well, in New York City, we have a massive scale, so we fortunately have probably a bigger supply than you might have in Las Vegas. But even over the last 10 years, when we've had a hiring freeze for most of the last 10 years, special ed is the one area where we are consistently having a shortage. And I think one of the challenges in special education that I would imagine is true in other cities is that because it's been an area, at least in New York, where we've had a hiring freeze, that's where all the brand new teachers can come into the system. And special ed is, an area where you want teachers with a lot of experience. You want teachers that have had the opportunity to develop and hone their craft. And so I think it's a problem across the board that maybe in part because of Liz's earlier point in that special ed is only 45 years old. But I think it's a challenge that we need to tackle.
My first year teaching in Harlem, I taught on West 29th in Amsterdam. I taught that it's like a 12-1-1 class. It basically is a small class with a parent. And of the kids who I had at the beginning of the year, of the students, 2 of the same students were the same at the end of the year, because it was really rotating students on superintendent suspension so they couldn't find replacement, and my school had open seats. And I'm thinking about that made my experience as a first-year teacher horrible. And I'm glad I stayed in special education, but I'm guessing that there are other things that are happening to special ed teachers that are leading them to leave that place where they can become great. So I think that there are some policy solutions that might involve paying special ed teachers more than their general peer, supporting general ed teachers to become certified and moved to the special ed classroom, making their, like, if you have more preps, you need more support, you need more resources, like thinking about how to hold principals accountable for retaining their special ed teachers.
I would just add, and echo, I'm sorry, were you done? I was just also gonna say, like, that's really, I see many families who have similar situations, and my heart goes out to you. And I'd be curious what Paul would say with a legal recourse would be. That's all. I was wondering the same thing. I was like, I would sue them. Where's the appropriate in this? It's pretty appropriate. But I think to echo Johanna's point, most of our special educators come from Teach for America as first-year core members, or through some of the TNTP certification programs that are available in New Orleans. And we work really hard to find veteran educators and advertise on TFA and get people down, etc. The one thing that has been somewhat promising, we have not struggled so much to fill our lead instructional positions. We've really struggled to provide really quality related services. If it's for a related service that we don't have the capacity to hire a full-time person for. And we have started, I feel like special ed teachers special ed folks are so resistant to change. And so I was like, online services, hell no, that sounds from, whatever. We've actually found some really great interventions through vendors that are now doing support online. And I don't know if that's a possibility. That certainly should be the school's responsibility, not yours as a parent. But that is one way that we've started to try and address the challenge of not having a physical body who can provide intervention. Yeah, what's the legal?
I'd have to charge you. I don't want to slow it down, but I'm going to have to get more information about what the circumstances were. I'm happy to talk about it.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Asad Muhammad. I work in high school turnaround in Detroit. My question was around how do you broaden the college-going culture and messaging to students who that may not be their desired life outcome, and with the growth of technology and the way that the world of work is changing and the world is changing, like how are you broadening that message around going to college and with those students? Because I just don't see the other side to that held up as an example that parents can point to or children can point to as, a great goal for themselves. And I'm struggling with that as I work in turnaround.
I just want to make sure I understand the question. Are you saying, how is it that you would get kids with disabilities to embrace the idea of going to college, or how do you get the community to embrace the idea that that's not the only option?
More of the second question, so I don't think it is the only option. So what are some of those other options that you have been exploring or presenting to families as great options?
A few different things. So we've been lucky, there's a community college in New Orleans that has a grant to accept students with intellectual and severe learning disabilities and do sort of a modified college programming approach. I think it's up at the end of this year, sadly, but there may be something like that exists either at a more traditional four-year college or university. I know like Minnesota, for example, has had some good success with doing those things at their schools. So there may be sort of modified programs out there that kids might be able to better wrap their minds around. I think we also need to diversify what we talk about when we talk about college. Is it traditional four-year college and university, or is there room in a community college setting? We have just started to try and really push our rehab services, our state rehab services, because those are the folks who can do a lot of the supported employment, and to work that into high school, so that our kids, while they're in high school, are also leaving school for part of the day and are getting job training during the day. And some of them have actually found, like, this is not actually what I want to do, and I am going to come back to the table with you and have that college conversation again. I think for kids with disabilities, we've also tried to expose them to some of the colleges and universities that are out there that target specifically kids with disabilities. And then I think there was something else that I was going to say that I am forgetting, so if I remember it, I will jump back in.
Yeah, I would say, so in New York State, we recently got rid of the IEP diploma, which was meaningless in New York State. It was not accepted by the military, it was not for anyone, which was a win, but I think a challenge for many of our students who are already in high school and maybe needed alternative options to college. One of the things that New York State has now done, which is to create the CDOS credential, which I think is Career Development and Occupational Studies. I'm pretty sure that's the acronym. But it's not meant to replace a Regents diploma or for a student, but rather to give a student an additional credential for career and work readiness opportunities, which I think there's been a real move away from that and a fear that kids would be put on like a vocational track. So I think it's a careful balance to figure out how to get kids access to those types of opportunities while they are in school, while also making sure that they are still working to achieve a high school diploma. It's one we're actively engaged in right now, so I don't have an answer to your question. I hopefully will in a few years, but I think it's an important question.
It might be worth looking into Providence. Providence, the CAO got together with business leaders and some technical schools and identified what is the workforce of Providence going to look like in 10, 15 years, and then began creating partnerships between technical schools and high schools to build those skills to create a talent pipeline for Providence. I can help connect you with someone where you can also Google Providence.
And another resource is just to look through thinkcollege.net. I don't know if you've looked at that much, but there's just lots of different success stories in terms of students with a range of disabilities accessing college, whether it's technical schools or more four-year programs or more both rehab-based. And there's examples of different programs around the country that partner with high schools and technical schools to develop those bridges to other pathways.
One other thing, I can't remember the website, I just need to pull up my computer, but we have our kids as part of the transition planning process do a career interest survey that is online. And we find that so often kids have no idea what career options are out there. So they're selecting from this incredibly limited sort of list or whatever their perceptions are of certain jobs. And that this survey actually opens their minds to things that hadn't occurred to them previously. And that also allows you to have a more expanded conversation. And you can talk about, all right, so to do that work, here's what you would need to do. And
I would say it's also kind of a continuation of the conversation about stigma. Because you guys identified very practical things that some of these kids could link to as transition, but another question is, what does your culture embrace? Is it the sort of culture where there's only one goal in this culture, and there's really only one way to measure success? And if it's only that one thing that I get to Harvard, that's going to be a tough environment for a lot of kids to navigate. It doesn't have to be the whole culture.
Excellent. We have two people who've been waiting very patiently for questions, so we'll let those two be our last two questions. So go ahead, and maybe the last one.
Yeah, this is a question about compliance, more so at the individual classroom level. Talking about accountability, I think part of my role in the last year was ensuring annual and triannual compliance. We weren't doing a very good job at it. We're doing a slightly better job now, but I don't see that as a high leverage thing for students. I don't know if we check in box and decide who's inducted. I have no idea. I don't have resources and the time. I'm an AP at the high school that has 900 kids. I have no idea if those kids are actually getting those accommodations that we say on this piece of paper that they're supposed to get. Will that accountability get any more really and specific? Do you see that coming? And are there resources that will come from maybe the federal level to make sure that those things are actually occurring in the classroom, not just at the paperwork level?
I think you have hit the nail on the head of what's been so problematic about special education, because it has focused so exclusively on the inputs, like what are we throwing at kids, and not what are we actually getting as a result of that, and that is changing at the federal level. So the new, Johanna, you probably know about this better than anybody, but the new ways that states are going to be assessed on their success is not whether they hit a whole bunch of compliance indicators, but also that students are achieving at higher levels. And so I'm going to fudge the exact numbers on this, but I think they did an analysis of the previous ways that they looked at indicators of special ed success. There was something like 39 out of 50 states met the criteria, and when they incorporate the new way of thinking about this when they're looking at student achievement metrics, it's only 18 of the states who hit that bar. So I think that that's the federal attempt to shift the conversation away from all of these checkboxes and paper program, we're doing the service, but actually what are we getting as a result of that? We have wrestled with the very issue that you're talking about because number one, it's hard to get folks who are really achievement oriented and talk about compliance because it doesn't have a whole lot to do with student achievement. We frame it at Renew as being reflective of our professionalism and how seriously we take the work. And then when we pass on a document to another school, it should absolutely reflect the utmost respect for a student and the goals that we have for them. So that's how we frame the quality. We turn it over to our teachers a lot. So we don't have a staff member who comes in and does compliance checks on file folders. We have our teachers come in for a meeting together and they exchange each other's file folders using a fidelity checklist, so they're holding each other accountable. But I think like you can't be in 95 different places at once. You can put measures in place. You can require teachers to have a box on the lesson plan where it very clearly indicates how they're going to accommodate particular instruction for specific students in their classrooms, and those are things that make it easier. But I think emphasizing the connection between hitting the compliance piece and how that relates to student achievement is important when you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the C word, compliance, is like sometimes a friend and oftentimes not a friend. But where you can monitor quality the most effectively, I think, is really locally. So like New York City, we are held to a number of state indicators. We regularly have IDEA meetings with New York State. But we also set a set of indicators for ourselves. And so like this past year, where we really focus on digging into both compliance but also quality are in 4 key areas. One is access, one is behavior, one is transition services, and one is, a fairly elusive definition, but we call it quality IEPs. And we've looked at a couple of indicators on our IEPs. And so in order for us to hold ourselves accountable to our own, sort of 4 key strands where we want to improve in this year and going into next year as well, we set a process for us to review a set of IEPs for a set of schools twice a year with some of our field staff, where we, include classroom observations. We look at a student's IEP from one year to the next and figure out whether the goals have changed. We look and see, what a student's recommendation was in the prior year, whether anything has changed there, and if something has changed, if there's a reason for it that's clearly indicated in the IEP. We look to see whether the present level of performance is a true hologram of the student, to see what, who that student really is, which is what an IEP should be, arguably. And obviously, in New York City, we have 210,000 students with IEPs. So we cannot do that for every single student. But what I would encourage, like when I talk to schools, I advise them to do the same thing. And what I would encourage you to do, if you are in a school with 900 students, is to have a team of people that you're working with to spot check. Like pull out some IEPs and sit there and evaluate, whether you think it's a quality document, just regardless of the time frame in which it was completed, although that is important, and go into a classroom and see if it matches up. I mean, that's really the only way that we are going to gauge, really, in a visceral way, whether this is meaningful for a kid. And compliance is the best thing we have right now to measure at systems level how this is happening, across our classrooms, across our schools. But it's only as meaningful as what's actually happening with a kid in the classroom.
Makes sense. So we'll take our last question, and then I have one closing question for the whole panel.
Okay. So my question, a little context behind it. I am a Title I, previously for the past 3 years, I'm a Title I reading specialist, so I teach high school reading. So the students who have my class are those 9th graders who are not on reading level. And so they're tier 2 being the highest, 3, 4 being the lowest. And so I'm thinking about one particular period I had last year. It's tier 4, so the lowest. 32 students, 25 IEPs. I have no inclusion teacher, no co-teacher, right? So 32 students, 25 IEPs, ranging from a reading level to teaching alphabet to a 5th grade reading level. So my question is, what would you recommend for a teacher who has no special ed training, but has a class or has a majority students with IEPs?
I recommend higher pay.
Learn something about reading assessment and give everyone an assessment. Step one, set up stations and figure out how to use technology.
Right.
There are some decent ones out there where you can put a Phonics online program, and then regularly track progress and then triage where you need triage.
And building on that, and figure out how you can group them based on ability so that you can get those things more efficiently, meet those student needs more efficiently. Using technology and stations are my two biggest strategies for that.
I've done that. I'm sure. I could be, but I know. Centers, technology, and I think, also if you have a good enough reading instrument, you may get to are we dealing with a phonics issue? Are we dealing with a fluency issue? Are we dealing with a comprehension issue?
Right, those tests as well.
Yeah, and so then you may have a couple different grouping configurations, and maybe you have an A day where I'm strictly grouping my kids by the level at which they are reading on grade level, and maybe I have a B day where I'm grouping them according to literacy need. But there's no way you're going to teach all 32 of those kids at once, right? Like it has got to be in small groups where you are rotating kids through independent work, online work, and working in small groups with you. And bless your heart.
Excellent. So our final question for the whole panel, on a more positive note, is what is your hope for the future of special education in the next decade, and what do you think it will take to realize that vision? We can go in order, or if you have an answer, go ahead.
I will try to have an answer. If I had an answer, we probably wouldn't be here right now. My great hope for special education is that it is not so separate. Like, I like to think that in the office that I lead at New York State Department of Education, that we could get to a place where I would only need a very small, lean team to work on, the most sort of esoteric instructional needs that students may have. And we would really rely on a lot of our partners in other areas across general education to meet a lot of the needs of our students. So my hope is that general education will get much stronger and special education will be a set of supports and services for students that require a very specialized setting in support of that instruction.
My hope for the future of special education is that we have much stronger connections on the district and school levels between what community supports and services are and the services that students receive in special education within the school setting. Because I feel like that's an area where if they were to actually work in tangent together, there's so much more growth that we could do, and special education could become such a smaller service within the school where it's not so much of a label, it's not a place, it's more of just a support that students receive. I'm not really sure how we would get there, but that's like just building those connections and making it more comprehensive, I think, is my hope for it.
I'd like to see a world in which the Chancellor of New York City Public Schools has special ed experience, where the Secretary of Education has special ed experience. I think we need more people in leadership who were special educators.
Similarly, I would just like to see more people doing this work and a more diverse population, frankly, of people doing this work. I know every year, well, this is year 2, right? But every year that they put together this panel, there's always like, who else can we have up here? It's the same small group of folks. And so that speaks to just, I think, a larger issue. With that, I also would like to see school leaders be required to have a lot more development around special education and too many leadership preparatory programs. Special ed is optional, and our kids are not. I think that's a huge problem. To Johanna's point, I would like to see less distinction between special and general education. I think there are some exciting developments in neuroscience. Our team read the book Schools for All Kinds of Minds recently, and it just sort of helps you think about every kid has strengths and weaknesses as a learner, and how do we think about that holistically across our student population and not just focus on kids who have a piece of paper to substantiate that. And lastly, I really want us to be focused on outcomes. What can we answer the question, is special education actually improving education for students with disabilities? And we need to be able to do that.
And I'll just pick up on that last piece, that we've been progressing away from a purely compliance framework. I mean, special education started the way that we have it now as a civil rights protection. kids who were being discriminated against. They weren't being educated at all. They were being, to the extent they were being educated, was completely segregated. So, you know, you want to be careful before you say, well, compliance doesn't matter, because I don't know what you think, but I think if they took away IEPs and rules, tomorrow morning kids with disabilities are not going to get very much. But having said that, there's not enough on the books that pushes us towards looking at outcomes of kids with disabilities. And we have to keep going in that direction and keep trying to find flexibility and not get so locked into the chapter and verse of the law is written exactly this way, so we can't possibly do it another way. We have to be flexible, and we have to keep moving to outcomes.
Excellent, very good. So I want to thank all the panelists and all of you in the audience for your participation.